In September 1940, the Battle of Britain reached a decisive moment. Throughout the summer, the fighter force of Britain had fought a desperate battle against the German Luftwaffe. German bombers and fighters crossed the English Channel day after day, and the skies above southern England filled with aircraft. Civilians and military personnel alike lived on a front line that now hung over towns, villages, and cities. Age and social position were no barrier. Teenagers in uniform manned anti-aircraft guns and radar stations. Women worked in operations rooms at factories. Older men joined the Home Guard and prepared to resist an invasion. Britain was welded together by a single aim: to defeat the aggressor and prevent Nazi Germany from gaining a foothold on British soil. By late summer, Adolf Hitler's Germany dominated most of continental Europe. German forces had overrun Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. Only Britain remained unconquered. The fall of France left many British people convinced that their country might be next, because the enemy now held ports all along the Channel coast and appeared to have overwhelming strength. Many believed that if the airfields in southern England were destroyed, the Germans could land troops within days, and the war would then be fought in British streets and fields. Outside observers might reasonably have asked how a small island nation could survive against such organized might. Yet determination hardened. Soldiers in training spoke openly of giving no quarter if invasion came, and the mood of the population was grimly resolved rather than defeated. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, believed that the German Air Force alone could force Britain to surrender. He promised Hitler that British fighter strength would be swept from the sky. To achieve this, the Luftwaffe concentrated attacks on airfields used by fighter squadrons, both in the air and on the ground. German formations often sent large sweeps of 100 or more fighters roving over southern England, hunting for British Hurricanes and Spitfires. British pilots were instructed not to waste strength engaging fighters alone when bombers were not present. To observers on the ground, this sometimes looked as if the Royal Air Force was no longer able or willing to fight, and a myth began to spread that British fighter forces were on the verge of collapse. In reality, they were bruised but still effective, and the outcome of the battle was not yet decided. The crucial phase came on Sunday, September 15th, 1940. On that day, from about 6:30 in the morning until well into the evening, a series of immense air actions unfolded that would mark a turning point in the war with Germany. Britain had already lived under the threat of invasion for more than 3 months. German landing barges were gathered in channel ports, and intelligence reports suggested that the enemy might attempt an assault at short notice. If fighter command failed, there seemed to be little to stop German troops from crossing the Channel and pressing onto London and the industrial Midlands. Many ordinary people felt that if the Luftwaffe broke British air defense, then the game was up and the country would face occupation. Britain's air defense network prepared itself for the 13 hours ahead. The defense of the United Kingdom was divided into 4 main fighter groups. Number 10 Group covered the southwest of England and South Wales. Number 11 Group defended London and the southeast. Number 12 Group guarded the Midlands and the East Coast. And Number 13 Group protected the northeast of England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Each group contained several sectors, each with its own airfields and squadrons. At the start of the day, at least one squadron from each sector was brought to immediate readiness, pilots strapped into their aircraft or waiting beside them on the grass, engines ready to start at a moment's notice. This integrated system owed much to the foresight of Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, the commander of Fighter Command. Before the war, he had reorganized British air defense so that radar stations on the coast, observer posts inland, and operations rooms on the ground could all share information rapidly. Plots of incoming raids appeared on large maps. Controllers calculated their strength and direction, and then ordered squadrons into the air at the right moment. The Germans had nothing comparable. They did not fully understand how effectively British radar and command networks could concentrate fighters at the decisive point. On September 15th, this system would be tested more severely than ever before. As dawn broke, church bells were silent because they were reserved as a warning of invasion, but air raid sirens and the low rumble of aircraft engines were familiar sounds. Anti-aircraft guns stood ready around London, the Thames estuary, and key ports. Fire brigades and medical services prepared for another day of bombing, while families who had spent the night in shelters emerged into a Sunday that might decide their future. Over the channel, Luftwaffe crews climbed into their Heinkel and Dornier bombers and Messerschmitt fighter escorts, briefed to smash London and force Fighter Command into a final, exhausting confrontation. Shortly after 8 in the morning, the first German aircraft began crossing the coast, and the decisive struggle for the skies over Britain entered its most critical day. On a Sunday morning in 1940, a lone German Heinkel bomber flies west along the English Channel on a weather reconnaissance mission, staying just outside the normal patrol lines of British fighters. Its progress is followed by one of the key innovations of the war, the radar network, that formed the heart of the doubting air defense system. Chain-home radar masts along the coast send out pulses that bounce off the aircraft and return to their receivers, giving early warning of any approaching enemy. Operators in darkened rooms watch glowing traces on cathode ray tubes and measure height, course, and speed. This information is sent to Headquarters Fighter Command, where it is filtered and plotted on large maps in the operations room, then passed to the regional group headquarters. From there, controllers relay the plots to individual sector stations that command the squadrons. Britain is learning to fight an air war with information. Instead of sending fighters to wander over the coast and hope to meet the enemy, the system aims to pick up bombers at about 90 miles range and only then scramble aircraft. The moment German machines lift off from their bases in occupied France, the radar stations can see them forming up and beginning to cross the channel. As the lone Heinkel comes within range of British fighters, the controller on duty at the group headquarters studies the updated plots and alerts the sector station responsible. The sector controller orders 2 Hawker Hurricanes at Exeter to take off and vector them toward the intruder using radio instructions and the constantly updated position traces. The British fighters close in at altitude and attack the reconnaissance bomber before it can escape. The Heinkel is shot down and crashes into the sea or countryside, and none of its 5-man crew survives, becoming among the first casualties of the day. While the people of southeast England go about their usual Sunday routines, many of them already used to air raid warnings and blackouts, another phase of the Battle of Britain is beginning. At the same time, on the other side of the channel, Luftwaffe crews at bases in occupied France prepare their aircraft for what they expect will be a decisive assault intended to break the Royal Air Force once and for all. Earlier, a conference has been held in The Hague under the chairmanship of Hermann Göring to review the state of fighter command. German pilots have been returning from missions claiming to have destroyed 10 or 20 Hurricanes and Spitfires at a time, but in reality, only a fraction of those numbers have been shot down. Despite this, overclaiming German intelligence convinces itself that the Royal Air Force is close to defeat, and High Command authorizes major raids designed to smash the remaining airfields and force Britain to its knees. By 9 in the morning, London is fully awake, and the capital begins another day under the threat of attack, while convoys move through the streets and people travel to work or to church. Around 10:30, Britain's air defenses go to full alert as radar shows large formations assembling over France. At the headquarters of No. 11 Group, which controls the fighter squadrons defending Southeast England Air, Vice Marshal Keith Park receives the news that Prime Minister Winston Churchill has chosen this critical day to visit the command center. In the underground operations room, Churchill stands behind the main plotting table beside the group controller in the bunker at Uxbridge and watches as colored markers multiply across the map of the channel. Each block represents a raid of bombers or their escorting fighters gathering over the French coast at rendezvous points before turning toward targets in the London area, the South Coast, and the Midlands. Staff move the counters across the table as fresh reports arrive from radar stations and from the Royal Observer Corps posts along the coast. What begins as a few scattered aircraft probing the defenses rapidly grows into signals of formations numbering more than 250 machines. Controllers must decide which squadrons to scramble and how high to send them and where to position them to intercept the incoming attacks without exhausting pilots or leaving gaps for a second wave. This system of radar, early warning ground control interception, and coordinated sector command is still relatively new, but on days like this it will determine whether British cities burn unchecked or whether the Luftwaffe is met by organized resistance in the sky. On the morning of September 15, 1940, during the climax of the Battle of Britain, Spitfires from 11 groups scramble from Biggin Hill. They climb rapidly toward their patrol line 25,000 feet above Canterbury. This is the heart of the British air defense system, where radar stations on the coast detect incoming raids and pass exact bearings, height, and estimated numbers to filter rooms. From their controllers in Fighter Command Group and Sector Operations, rooms direct squadrons onto the enemy. On this day, the radar plots show a massive buildup of Luftwaffe formations over the channel. More than 200 German aircraft, bombers with fighter escort, cross the French coast and will toward England, convinced that the Royal Air Force is nearly beaten and that London now lies open to attack. At 11:36 in the morning, the first large formation crosses the English coastline near Folkestone. Anti-aircraft guns on the ground open fire, throwing black bursts of flak into the clear late summer sky. Civilians on the farms and in the small towns of Kent look up and see the bombers streaming inland, steady tight formations rather than the high-speed jets familiar today. Many families have prepared shelters in their gardens or under their houses, while others head for public shelters and church crypts. Children from London have already been evacuated to the countryside in a program known as Operation Pied Piper. Yet they now find that the front line of the air war runs directly above the fields and villages where they have been sent for safety. Once the enemy aircraft cross the coastline, the Observer Corps supplements radar by tracking them visually with binoculars and range finders, reporting type, height, direction, and numbers to local centers. These reports go simultaneously to Fighter Command and to the controlling group. Using this information, controllers decide when and where to commit their squadrons. Above Canterbury, Spitfires from 92 and 72 squadrons sight the incoming bombers and dive to attack from height, aiming first at the escort fighters and then at the bomber formations. Other squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires join the battle as the German force pushes inland toward London. Dogfights break out across the sky over the county once called the Garden of England. The roar of engines, bursts of machine gun fire, and curling white vapor trails mark the turning points of the engagements. Aircraft are hit and fall away trailing smoke, some crashing in fields and villages, others plunging into the channel. Over the capital itself, civilians hear sirens and the thump of anti-aircraft guns, and many descend into the London underground stations that serve as deep shelters. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe has lost a significant number of bombers and fighters, far more than British planners had dared to hope, while the Royal Air Force remains an effective fighting force. The failure of these raids to break Fighter Command contributes to Adolf Hitler's decision to postpone and eventually abandon plans for an invasion of Britain. The date September 15th, 1940 is later remembered as Battle of Britain Day, a moment when the combined work of radar operators, observers, controllers, ground crews, anti-aircraft gunners, pilots, and ordinary civilians helped ensure that Britain stayed in the war and that the wider course of World War II would be changed. In 1940, during the Battle of Britain, ordinary Londoners were already learning how to live with air raids. Some families were sent into nearby caves that had been converted into improvised shelters. Inside, there was almost no light, and people were given hurricane lamps just to find their way. They received thin mattresses to lay on the stone floor and a few blankets for warmth. At the very beginning, only a small number of civilians were down there, and at first there was still no sound of engines, bombs, or guns above them. Yet some people refused to stay underground. Curious civilians stepped back outside to watch events in the sky and saw a huge formation of British fighter Spitfires and Hurricanes, perhaps 50 or 60 aircraft climbing together to intercept German bombers heading for London. As the German formations crossed the coast and moved toward the capital, people on the ground heard the deep, steady drone of many engines long before they saw the aircraft. Young plane spotters who had already studied aircraft recognition could distinguish German bombers, such as Heinkel types, by sound alone, and could also tell them apart from British fighters. And the Air Fighter Command concentrated its strength over the city. Under the control of Air Vice Marshal Keith Park of No. 11 Group, 6 fighter squadrons were already over London, with another 6 squadrons flying in from neighboring sectors. In total, more than 125 RAF fighters, Hurricanes, and Spitfires moved to attack the incoming Luftwaffe stream. The German bombers were flying at about 15 to 20,000 feet in clear blue sky, with their remaining Messerschmitt escorts above and around them. British tactics usually sent Hurricanes against the bomber formations while Spitfires tried to engage the German fighters. Pilots remembered closing in until enemy aircraft seemed to fill the windscreen, and then seeing fragments of metal and debris burst away when their guns found the mark. At times, the sky over London became a tangled mass of machines, with RAF fighters, German fighters, and bombers twisting and diving around one another. With so many aircraft in a relatively small airspace, pilots sometimes lost sight of their own squadron and felt momentarily alone in the middle of the battle. To people watching from the ground, the aircraft looked like dark moths against the sun, and it was often impossible to tell which were friend and which were enemy. For the German crews, the experience was a shock. Many have been told that the Royal Air Force was close to defeat. Instead, as they approached London, they suddenly faced another 50 or 60 defending fighters rising to meet them. Morale suffered, and a number of bombers turned away quickly once they reached the city, jettisoning their bombs as they withdrew. On the ground, some civilians hardly heard the sound of individual explosions when bombs fell very close. At that distance, the blast wave arrived almost together with the detonation. Windows were blown inward, and people were thrown off their feet and into nearby water or debris in a fraction of a second. In several cases, the glass shattered only moments before the shock wave hurled bodies through the opening, a delay that probably saved lives. Not every bomber escaped. One German aircraft was shot down over the area near the site of the old Bethlehem Psychiatric Hospital, later used as the Imperial War Museum. The pilot descended by parachute into the grounds and was immediately surrounded by a crowd of angry Londoners before soldiers and police intervened. Scenes like this took place many times during the Battle of Britain and the later Blitz. They show not only the scale of the air war above the capital, but also the experience of civilians and pilots who lived through those critical days when the fate of Britain in the Second World War was being decided in the skies over London. On 15 September 1940, the Battle of Britain reached one of its decisive days. Late in the morning, large German bomber formations with fighter escort crossed the English Channel and headed for London. British radar stations and observers on the coast tracked them as they approached. Squadrons of Spitfires and Hurricanes from No. 11 Group were scrambled to intercept. As the bombers came inland, they were already under heavy attack. Some German crews began to lose confidence. Pilots who had never before seen so many British fighters in the air at one time decided to turn back. Two bombers broke away from the main formation and dived to gain speed, releasing their bombs as they tried to escape. One bomb exploded close to civilians on the ground, forcing people to run for the nearest shelters and natural caves. Above them, the larger German formation continued toward London, but the fighters of the Royal Air Force stayed on it, harrying it all the way. The commander of that German force, Alois Lindmayr, understood that a scattered formation would be destroyed. He kept his bombers packed tightly together and ordered a disciplined retreat once it was clear that the attack had failed. Under constant fighter attacks, he managed a skillful withdrawal and brought many of his aircraft back across the channel. Shortly before 1 in the afternoon, the air raid sirens gave the all-clear over London and the southeast of England. People emerged from shelters to find streets filled with dust, smoke, and broken glass. Many houses and small businesses, such as family-owned grocers and fruit shops, had been reduced to rubble. Fire crews fought burning buildings for hours. Ambulance workers searched shattered homes for survivors and recovered the bodies of those who had not made it to shelter in time. In some streets, almost nothing recognizable remained above ground. Inside the underground operations room of No. 11 Group at Uxbridge, controllers cleared the plotting table of enemy markers. Reports showed that during this first raid, the Luftwaffe had lost around 18 aircraft, while the Royal Air Force had lost 13 fighters. For the British command, these were acceptable losses, but they knew that more raids were forming over northern France. German leaders hoped that a second and even larger assault that afternoon would finally break fighter command and open the way for invasion plans that had been given the code name Sea Lion. Instead, the day would end with total German losses of more than 50 aircraft, roughly double the British losses, a turning point that later led the British government to name 15 September Battle of Britain Day. For ordinary people, the history of that day was written in small scenes. In gardens across the suburbs, residents came out to find unexploded bombs, craters, and sometimes the white canopy of a parachute caught in an apple tree. Some of those parachutes belonged to German aircrew who had bailed out and been captured by local Home Guard units. Often men in improvised uniforms carried in the back of small civilian trucks with only 1 or 2 rifles between them. Many of the captured airmen were described as confident and convinced that Britain would soon surrender. On the British side, anger was intense. Families who had seen their homes destroyed or relatives killed repeated the bitter saying that the only good German was a dead German. At the same time, the routines of life continued in strange new forms. Children searched the streets for jagged pieces of bomb and shell casing. Shrapnel became a kind of currency among boys who traded it as trophies in the same way earlier generations had swapped cigarette cards. Getting out into the street first, after a raid, meant a better chance of finding rare pieces from German aircraft. The first great raid of that Sunday did not break British resistance. Instead, it showed that coordinated radar control, skilled fighter direction, and the courage of pilots and ground crews could blunt even the strongest air assault that Germany could send across the channel. The destruction on the ground was terrible, but fighter command survived. The German losses were heavy, and Adolf Hitler would never again come so close to launching a full-scale invasion of Britain. The events of 15 September 1940 became a symbol of how civilians and airmen together endured the worst that the Luftwaffe could deliver and how the defense of British skies helped shape the wider course of World War II. In the summer and autumn of 1940, Britain stood almost alone in Europe. The German Air Force was determined to break British resistance by destroying cities, airfields, and industry from the air. For civilians, the war came into their streets and backyards. Children picked over fresh bomb sites as soon as the wardens and rescue teams had finished their work searching for little treasures among the rubble. Sometimes they found far more dangerous things. Magnesium incendiary bombs designed to burn through roofs could be mistaken for interesting pieces of metal and carried home as souvenirs. On workbenches and sheds and kitchens, curious boys tried to drill into them without understanding that the metal itself would ignite when it grew hot. Parents lived with the constant fear that one careless moment could turn into tragedy. Yet for many young people, the devastation also carried a strange sense of adventure that mixed with the terror and exhaustion of total war. Against this background, the key battles for the survival of the country were being fought in the skies over southern England. By mid-1940, the British had built a chain of radar stations along the coast, which could detect incoming aircraft while they were still over the channel. On a Sunday afternoon, the operators in those stations began to see a massive new buildup of contacts forming on their screens. Around 20 minutes before 2 in the afternoon, reports flowed into fighter command that a great concentration of German aircraft was crossing the French coast and heading toward England. The exact number could not be read from the early radar sets, but experienced controllers estimated more than 400 machines. Many British fighter squadrons had already been in action that morning, and their pilots and ground crews were in the middle of refueling and rearming when the new alarm came through. Orders went out at once to get every serviceable Hurricane and Spitfire back into the air. Across the channel, the Luftwaffe was forming 3 great columns of bombers and fighters. Their commanders believed that another heavy blow might finally wreck the British air defense system and open the way for invasion. High above the water, a single forward patrolling Spitfire was sent to climb to more than 26,000 feet and watch for the incoming raid. The pilot circled alone in the thin air, listening to the calm voices of the ground controllers and relaying what he could see with his own eyes as the German formations drew nearer. A few minutes later, over 450 enemy aircraft crossed the English coast. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, who commanded the group defending London and the southeast, ordered each squadron that reached readiness to take off at once and requested additional support from neighboring commands. In total, around 275 British fighters were scrambled to meet approximately 100 bombers and more than 350 escorting fighters, while the pilots climbed civilians on the ground, tried to continue with their ordinary lives. In London, a young bride left the church in her white dress, still believing that her wedding day was over and peaceful. Families started the walk home from the ceremony because the city had not yet learned to expect such vast daylight attacks. Others were already used to danger. A cyclist on a country road looked up to see an aircraft skimming past at rooftop height and threw his bicycle aside to run for shelter as the machine roared overhead. The first clashes came shortly after 2 in the afternoon high above Romney Marsh as 3 squadrons of Spitfires hurled themselves out of the sun in steep dives aimed at the bomber formations. British tactics sent the more agile Spitfires against the German fighter cover, while the rugged Hurricanes were often directed toward the bombers themselves. Pilots described seeing hundreds of enemy aircraft ahead of them in tight defensive boxes and choosing one bomber to aim at before everything dissolved into confusion. Closing from slightly above and behind, they fired short bursts into engines and fuel tanks, then had only seconds to pull away before the deadly crossfire from gunners and escorting fighters reached them. German fighter pilots flying Messerschmitt 109s were restricted by orders to stay close to the bombers, which made it harder for them to dive freely on the attacking Spitfires. As the first British attacks broke up the bomber formations, the escort fighters dropped down to engage, and the sky filled with twisting individual duels. Tracer rounds and pieces of burning aircraft fell through the clouds, while contrails and smoke marked the paths of turning dogfights. On the ground, people watched this vast struggle with a mixture of awe and dread. Air raid sirens sounded across towns and villages in the southeast, warning that the battle overhead might soon bring bombs and wreckage down on streets and houses. Railway stations that seemed like safe shelters could suddenly become targets. In many places, civilians simply stood and stared from doorways and gardens as the sound of engines built into a continuous roar and the sky above them shimmered with the movement of hundreds of machines. Despite the fierce defense, many German bombers managed to fight their way through the screen of fighters and reach the outskirts of London, where anti-aircraft guns opened fire and a familiar pattern of explosions, smoke, and falling debris began again. Yet the cost of the attackers was high. The radar network, early warning by the lone patrol aircraft, and the coordinated response of Fighter Command turned what the Luftwaffe hoped would be a decisive blow into another exhausting and costly engagement. Days like this slowly wore down German strength and showed that Britain could not easily be bombed into surrender. The experiences of the civilians and children beneath the raids and the pilots who fought above them became part of the larger story of the Battle of Britain, a struggle in which technology, organization, and ordinary courage combined to prevent invasion and shape the course of the Second World War. In September 1940, London lived under the constant threat of air raids. Families waited in Anderson's shelters and listened for the distant growl of engines. On the 15th of September in the early afternoon, people stepped out into their streets and gardens and saw something they had never witnessed before: an enormous stream of aircraft crossing the sky. At about 2:30 in the afternoon, the first of London's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The city had barely more than 200 heavy guns and was desperately short of proper air defense, but the barrage still had an effect. The bursts of shellfire disturbed the approaching German bomber formations and at the same time created dark puffs in the sky that helped British fighter pilots find their targets. From the cockpits of Spitfires and Hurricanes, pilots often could not see the bombers themselves at a distance. What they saw first was the pattern of explosions from the guns, and they steered straight towards that boiling cloud of smoke. Somewhere in the middle of those bursts, the German bombers were pushing on toward London and the south of England. The air battle stretched 60 miles back from the capital to the English coast. High above towns and countryside, the sky filled with twisting and turning fighters, vapor trails and columns of smoke from damaged aircraft. To people on the ground, the memory was one of bombers coming down, trailing smoke, engines screaming, and then hitting the ground with a violent crash. Inside the RAF command system, the strain grew by the minute. Operations rooms tried to keep track of every squadron in the air, while plotters moved colored markers across large tables. As more and more formations engaged in dogfights, the situation boards showed total commitment. Contrary to the idea of a calm war room, veterans later recalled that during major raids the operations centers were crowded, noisy and chaotic as controllers shouted orders and updated information. Prime Minister Winston Churchill visited one of these rooms on that day and watched the crowded plotting table. He understood that the battle was reaching a decisive point and asked how many reserves remained. The answer was that none were left. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, responsible for the defense of London and the southeast, had committed every available fighter squadron. The fate of the capital now rested on the pilots already in the air. Shortly before 3 in the afternoon, the main battle raged over southeast England. Every serviceable RAF fighter was airborne, pushing its pilots to the limits of endurance. Despite their efforts, some German bombers still broke through the defense line. When they reached London, the city lay under cloud, and many crews could not see their assigned targets clearly. Instead, they released their bomb loads over the general area of the city. On the ground, civilians felt the result as sudden heavy thumps, houses shaking and windows shattering. Families sheltering in basements or understairs were thrown into darkness as the power failed and dust and debris filled the air. Some people emerged to see familiar streets transformed. Roofs had been blown away, walls sliced open so that rooms inside houses stood exposed to the open air, wallpaper and furniture hanging above piles of rubble. Factories, shops and churches were damaged or destroyed. Ordinary Londoners ran for cover as bombs fell around them, trying to reach public shelters or underground stations. In some cases, the structure of a shelter or a wall deflected the blast and saved those inside, while killing others only a few feet away, a reminder of the random cruelty of high explosive. The events of that day formed part of what later became known as the Battle of Britain Day, a turning point in the wider Battle of Britain. Between July and October 1940, the German Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the Royal Air Force and break British resistance as a prelude to a planned invasion of the United Kingdom. On the 15th of September, more than 1,000 aircraft from both sides took part in repeated waves of attack and defense over southern England. Although London suffered bomb damage and many civilians were killed or injured, the RAF shot down or badly damaged a significant number of German bombers and fighters. The scale of the losses convinced the German leadership that daylight raids on this scale were too costly. In the weeks that followed, the Luftwaffe shifted its main effort to night bombing, beginning the long period of the Blitz, but it failed to gain air superiority. The endurance of the fighter squadrons, the work of the controllers and gunners, and the resilience of civilians sheltering under bombardment ensured that Britain stayed in the war at a moment when defeat had seemed possible. In September 1940, the air war over Britain reached a critical moment. For weeks, German bombers and their fighter escorts had hammered London and the airfields of southeast England in daylight raids. On the 15th of September, the Luftwaffe launched 2 major attacks aimed at breaking RAF Fighter Command and clearing the way for a seaborne invasion called Operation Sea Lion. The first formations crossed the channel around midday, heavily escorted by fighters. British radar stations and the ground control system detected them and scrambled squadrons from across southern England. Spitfire and Hurricane pilots climbed to intercept, often outnumbered but guided by an increasingly efficient network of controllers, observers, and radio communications. Over London and the counties to the south and east, furious battles developed. Many German bomber crews had already flown numerous missions and knew that once their escort fighters turned for home, they would become easy targets for RAF pilots waiting to pounce on the stragglers. Bombs were scattered over a wide area of southeast London, but the defenses were now better coordinated than in the early weeks of the battle. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with shell bursts, and British fighters attacked the bomber streams before and after they released their loads. As the German formations tried to withdraw, some of their escort fighters were forced to leave early with fuel running low, creating gaps in the screen. RAF pilots dove on the retreating bombers, and many German aircraft were shot down as they tried to cross the channel. During the afternoon, a second large raid approached, again heading for London and key industrial targets, such as the Spitfire factories around Southampton. Despite exhaustion and losses, several RAF squadrons were sent up once more. British fighters intercepted the attackers and broke up their formations before the bombers could inflict serious damage. By the end of the day, cloud was building and the prospect of further raids faded, bringing relief to civilians and airmen who had endured hours of combat and air raid warnings. The cost to the Luftwaffe was severe. In total, between 350 and 400 German aircraft took part in the two main attacks. German records show that 79 aircraft and more than 130 train crewmen were lost in a single day, while the RAF lost 29 fighters with 12 pilots killed. Claims in the heat of battle were higher on both sides, but the final figures still represented a clear British victory at a time when losses of experienced German aircrew were becoming increasingly hard to replace. 2 days later, Adolf Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion. He now understood that the Luftwaffe had failed to destroy fighter command and could not guarantee air superiority over the Channel and the invasion beaches. For many British people, that day became a symbol of their narrow escape from defeat. Civilians in shelters watched young RAF pilots, some barely out of school, come in from the rain with their flying gear still on and treated them as heroes who were defending every home in the country. The 15th of September 1940 is often described as the finest hour of the RAF during the Battle of Britain, the first clear military defeat suffered by Nazi Germany in the Second World War. Night bombing of British cities would continue, and the war would last almost 5 more years, but the threat of an invasion of the British Isles had been removed. Britain survived as a base from which the Allies could later return to the continent, and the courage of the pilots and ground crews on that day helped secure the freedom of the country and the future course of the war.